Welcome to Carbon Politics, a CSE podcast series decoding the politics of climate change from the lens of the Global South. In this series, we will explore multiple critical questions that are surrounding and pressuring the climate debate today. What happens next on multilateralism, or where is the current trade system going? And how does the global financial architecture need to be reformed? How are these systems influencing the ability of developing countries to address, respond to, and adapt to climate change? These are some of the critical questions we hope to answer, and we hope you join us on this journey this year.
The United States has been making headlines for quite some time now, beginning initially with the tariff wars from last year, to more recently, the capture of the Venezuelan head of state and his wife. And amongst all the chaos, what might seem like a footnote, they've also made headlines for exiting key climate treaties globally. For instance, the Paris Agreement and the landmark UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. More recently, they also made an announcement that they are going to be exiting the IPCC itself. So, for climate policy analysts, this isn't just symbolism. This is a signal, a very clear vocal signal to the world that one of the largest emitters decided unilaterally that climate cooperation at a global level is merely optional. So what does that now mean for global climate cooperation and action? And also, more importantly, for equity, finance, and trust between the global community. As we have this conversation today, the Davos summit in Switzerland is also underway, with heads of state making speeches that are sparking intense debates, and rightly so. So the question that we're asking is, in this situation and heightened geopolitical climate, what does the world do now for climate action? To answer these questions and more, we have with us today Brandon Wu, Director of Policy and Campaigns at ActionAid USA, which is an international network working towards a just, equitable, and sustainable world. Thank you for joining us, Brandon.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just get into the first question that we have for you today. So ActionAid USA, your organization, said publicly in a statement that the United States' exit from the UNFCCC should be seen as part of a broader agenda of the United States becoming, I quote, unbound by international rules. And you also linked it to the administration's wider foreign policy posture, such as the US actions on Venezuela. Can you unpack that link for us a little bit more? What does the wider geopolitical stance of the United States mean for global climate policy? And does this imply, or is it correct to say, that we no longer have a multilateral system that forms the bedrock for climate cooperation? Over to you, Brandon.
Yeah, so I want to be really clear that when we said that the United States wants to be a country unbound by international rules, the words we actually used was the Trump administration wants the U.S. essentially to become a rogue state, unaccountable to anyone else in the international community or even most voters here at home in the United States. That doesn't necessarily mean that that is the reality, right? Of course, the United States is bound by its relationship to others in the world and to its citizens. But what the Trump administration is projecting is that it wants a world of might makes right, where the United States, because we have the most power and frankly, the most weaponry, we as a country can do basically whatever we want. And that might include, for example, attacking a country without any provocation. It might include then stealing that country's oil for personal gain, not necessarily even for national gain, but for personal gain. These are the sorts of things that they want to be able to do, and that they are essentially challenging the world right now. Are you going to do anything about this? Like, you see everything that's happening. What are you going to do about it? They are daring the rest of the world right now. And they're saying that explicitly. One of Trump's top advisors said about Greenland, nobody's going to go to war with the United States over Greenland. And I think thankfully we're seeing that the Europeans are growing some backbone, and it may not be that simple. You mentioned Davos. We had a very interesting speech a couple of days ago from the Canadian Prime Minister, hardly a radical, by the way. Mark Carney is a liberal who said basically that the international rules-based order has always been a bit of a fiction, and that we always knew that the strongest countries would exempt themselves when convenient, I think were his exact words. And I think having a head of state say that openly is actually quite useful. This order has always been held up kind of by major countries enforcing the rules when it fit their agendas, but not all the time. And now what we're seeing is the United States breaking away from that entirely and deciding that, well, this is actually completely irrelevant. We're no longer even going to pretend that this is the thing, and we're going to go our own way. And so it wasn't just the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the IPCC that we exited, but actually 66 multilateral agreements that Trump decided were not in the interests of the United States anymore, by which he means not in the interest of himself and his cronies. And I also want to make the link as a bit of an aside that we're also seeing this kind of the same kind of violence that this administration is imposing on the rest of the world, they're also doing at home. And so we are seeing outright open violence against, in particular, Black and brown people in the United States. We're seeing it right now in Minneapolis. Trump essentially has a secret police force that he is using to punish political opponents, and to enact really a white supremacist agenda here at home, as well as what he's doing abroad.
Right. And so, to my question previously, do we no longer have a multilateral system? I guess you're saying the system was always part fiction. It's just become a bit more blatant with the recent actions of this administration. Is that right?
Yeah, I think with the actions of this administration, that's exactly right. The fiction of the old world order is coming apart. And so that doesn't mean that there's no possibility for multilateral cooperation on issues like the climate crisis or on economic justice or anything like that. But it does mean that we're going to need to figure out what a new system looks like, and who the major players in that new system are going to be, while the U.S. is well, I don't want to say absent, because of course the U.S. is imposing its will in many ways that are harmful to the rest of the world. So how do we deal with the problem of the United States?
No, that actually is a helpful segue into my next question for you. So if we can zoom out a little further and keep this US foreign policy thread and its links with climate going. There's a lot of commentary, especially in the last few months or weeks to be precise, about how the world is seeing a Monroe doctrine style approach by the United States to Latin America, Canada, Greenland. You know, there's more pressure and deal making and less cooperation and mutual benefit, right? How does that spill into climate issues such as critical minerals, migration, or even development finance? The question that I'm asking is, given that the United States is leading on these approaches, what format of cooperation for climate are we likely to see going forward by other countries and other, national governments and other players?
Let me address something you said initially first, which is this idea of a Monroe Doctrine style approach. The Trump administration has been quite explicit about this, right? They tweeted a graphic of, it was a famous Monroe Doctrine graphic, actually showing the United States as a person straddling the entire Western Hemisphere and essentially claiming ownership. And they renamed it the Monroe Doctrine for Donald Trump, of course. And so they're not being subtle about any of this, right? They're making their intentions extremely clear. They made a statement saying this hemisphere is ours, meaning the entire hemisphere. Like they believe somehow should be under our not even our hegemony, but our explicit ownership. So it's all very clear. There's no guessing that we have to do here about what their agenda is, and the effects on climate are already devastating, right? We have the United States has already rolled back all kinds of climate regulations at home. we have gutted federal scientific agencies that have been doing crucial research on climate change and on ways to address climate change. The entire operation in Venezuela is at least partly about oil extraction, and they want to ramp up oil production dramatically in ways that, frankly, may not actually be possible, but that is their goal. Their quite explicitly, again, stated goal. And of course, on issues like, I mean, you mentioned development finance, that's basically non-existent from the United States now, right? Again, it's this white supremacist ideology saying, oh, any money that we're giving to other countries is essentially theft. It's a waste of money, right? But it's not like they're reinvesting that money in the people of the United States. They're putting it in their own pockets. Trump has enriched himself by an estimate of $1.5 billion just in the past year through various forms of grift. And so the response that demands from other countries, I believe, should be to ostracize the United States and move forward together. The U.S. no longer being in the UNFCCC, that can be a blessing. The U.S. has always been the biggest blocker of progress in the UN climate negotiations. We watered down the Kyoto Protocol. We watered down the Paris Agreement. And then, we didn't even ever sign on to the Kyoto Protocol. We have withdrawn from the Paris Agreement twice now. And yet we are always the ones preventing further ambition on mitigation, on finance, on justice. And so now the world has a chance to move ahead. And it should do so with the urgency that the crisis requires. And we will do our part in the US as residents and citizens of the United States, to make sure that this regime, when they're out of power, we are able to rejoin those international agreements. But the rest of the world needs to move on, right? The rest of the world cannot wait for the United States while this administration is in power.
And the rest of the world has not been waiting. I mean, we see a lot of renewable capacity addition actually being led by global South countries. The EU is, I think, in an interesting position with respect to all this, both at COP and outside, but we can get to that in a minute. Thank you. Just on to my final question, or theme at least, for what I wanted to pick your brain about today. Now that the US is playing a blatantly more disruptive role, like you said, they've always been blockers at the climate talks, but now it's a much more disruptive stance across the board, not just with climate diplomacy or climate politics. If climate cooperation is to be upheld, let's get a little specific. Who will do that now? Right? We mentioned there are other big emitters, there are other historical emitters, there are other emitters who've caught up recently. There are also people who pay the price doubly hard almost always when there are climate impacts. So who is going to uphold that now? Who actually fills this gap, if we're calling it that, and if we're agreeing that there is a gap, at least in the interim or in the short term? Is it going to be other big emitters or coalitions of the willing, or country clubs or other common interest clubs, right? Or subnational actors? Are they going to come in and take more of a lead? Is it going to be the courts? We had the ICJ advisory opinion. Is it finance institutions? Who, in your opinion, is the onus on now, and who should lead the agenda? I know that's a tall ask, all packed into one question, but just want to understand who the onus is on now. Yeah.
I mean, it's a tall ask, partly because the nature of the climate crisis is that we need all of the above, right? Everything you just mentioned
Absolutely.
needs to happen. But in terms of sort of clear possible leaders, I mean, I think you mentioned it, right? It's the global South that is really implementing the kind of change at the scale we need. India with solar capacity, China with solar and wind capacity, right? These are the things that other big emitters need to be doing. And if I were in the governments of say China or India, I would see the US essentially exit from its own old version of imperialism and its own old version of economic hegemony. I would see that as a massive opportunity, right? The United States is doubling down on fossil fuels, which we know are on the way out, right? It's an undeniable fact. And the United States is almost fully withdrawing public support from renewable energy spaces and sectors where we know the future really lies, right? That's a massive opportunity for the rest of the world. And China in particular, and also India, are well positioned to take advantage of that. And I would say that we would also need then a rapid and just transition plan away from fossil fuels, not just an increase in renewable energy capacity, and a rapid investment in adaptation and resilience and loss and damage as well, and supported by international finance.
Mm-hmm.
But these are the countries that are in a position to take advantage of potentially a new order. Now, the European countries also, have a huge role to play, particularly as providers of finance. We would like to see them fill the gap, at least in the short term, that has been left by the U.S., and they haven't so far been proven willing to do that. And I think that's something that needs to change for all of this to work. And so, it is going to be a sort of coalition of the willing, as you say. We're seeing that a little bit on fossil fuel phase out. We saw last year at the COP that Colombia and the Netherlands created a process outside the UNFCCC to begin conversations about a fossil fuel phase out. Now, that's going to be another highly political process, whether that's going to be just and equitable, and are the global north countries going to volunteer to take the lead as they need to do in order to make this work? We'll see. But there's clearly interest from some countries in having that conversation, absent some of the explicit blockers like the United States. And so, again, I think we're beginning to see some of this creative thinking and momentum to have the kind of climate cooperation we need, even in this current very difficult political environment.
You're right. And the environment has been difficult for some time now. That hasn't stopped domestic governments from doing what they need to do and what they can do, whether that's the global north or the global south. Thanks a lot, Brandon. These are the questions from me. Do you have any remaining closing remarks that you'd like to share with our viewers before we close?
Yeah, I would, just saying one thing I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., and I think one thing that's quite important for folks to understand is that the actions of the Trump administration are not popular. They're not supported by a majority of voters in the United States. His withdrawal from international agreements, his use of heavily militarized force against U.S. citizens, his use of the military in Venezuela, bombing of other countries as well, like Iran. None of this is popular. His approval ratings are extremely low. And so we are working as a people to try to stop all of this. The problem right now is that Trump knows he's not popular and he doesn't care. He is attempting to just seize power in ways such that it doesn't actually matter what people think. He's trying to set himself up as an authoritarian ruler, in part because he doesn't want to be able to care. He doesn't want to have to care about what the American people think. But as long as we're able to have free elections in this country, what Trump is doing will get him and his party voted out. The work is to make sure that, one, that happens, and two, that we are able to preserve a semblance of democracy, because that is very much explicitly under threat as well.
Absolutely. And I think democracy being under threat and global cooperation being under threat are all detrimental to the climate cause. And like you said right at the start, this is something that everyone needs to do their part for, regardless of what the ups and downs of the global geopolitical situation is. So on that note, not very hopeful, but I guess very real, very realistic note. Yeah, that's the end of this episode. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Washington, D.C. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
That's the end of this episode of Carbon Politics, where we talked about how the US's current actions of exiting multilateral climate treaties is going to impact the rest of the world. Maybe this is an opportunity and not just a crisis. Thank you for watching.